Have we?
Some would say not. How do people feel about it? And that's what I'll be hoping to talk to lots of people about, with lots more coming up as well, as you can imagine.
That's that's really interesting. 2016, of course. I remember 2020, of course, with the terrible COVID years.
2019, we officially came out.
Yeah. I remember, Nick. I was there. I was there.
As I would expect, at the barricades, weren't we?
We were. We took the Union flag out of the European Parliament. Thanks ever so much for your company this morning. I'll be back tomorrow at 6. But next up, Nick de Bois.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
And welcome. Well, I'm definitely not Peter Cardwell. He is on his sickbed and will be for the weekend. We wish him well. He will, I'm sure, be back next week, of course. But I have the pleasure of being dragged out of retirement to come and join you for this weekend, and an honour to sit in the hot seat for Peter Cardwell. And speaking of pensions, well, I've got to ask you, how do you feel about all this talk about, first of all, either abandoning that triple lock, which gives the guaranteed minimum rise to your pension, which has been in place since I think about 2010, and further talk that says, do you know, means testing the pension is not a bad idea. That's what's been put around in political circles, and I think the only party that have robustly come out and said nothing like that is on the table is the Reform Party. How do you feel about a potential threat to the state pension? 0344 499 1000. You can call me, you can message us, of course, on that same number on WhatsApp, 0344 499 1000. For those of you that were kind enough to listen to me in the past, as you know, I will put your calls through as soon as I can. We got lots of other things to discuss today, and to help me navigate that, I'm very pleased to welcome Amy Fisher, former Director of Comms for the Conservative Party. Yeah,
Morning. Hi, Nick.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone.
They could probably do with another comms director at the Conservative Party, couldn't they?
I pass no comment
Oh,
on that.
maybe Amy's applying for the job.
Maybe.
Amy's applying for the job. We never know. We'll try and reveal more. And on the other side of the fence, Matthew Hulbert, regular to this show, Lib Dem activist. How are you?
I'm very well. It's good to see you, Nick. It's been a wee while, hasn't it?
It has. I'm fresh from retirement. I've been enjoying my weekends.
You're looking wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you both here. We got lots to talk about, and I'll be running through during the course of the morning. And if we get any calls on the subjects, I'll try and filter them to you, if I may. So if you've got questions for Amy, or you've got questions for Matthew, or you just want to share your opinion on how you feel about the potential threat to the state pension, call me on 03444 99 1000. Also, on the programme today, we are going to be, well, were you aware? 2019, we officially came out of the EU. It's the 5-year anniversary coming up at the end of this month, January the 29th. Well, I won't be here on January 29th, so I'm asking you today, how do you feel about Brexit? Has it been a success? Is it a disappointment? Do you regret if you voted to leave? Or do you think, having voted Remain, you did the wrong thing? 0344 499 1000. We'll be catching up on the Middle East. Alistair Burt is joining me, former Minister for the Middle East in the last Conservative government, to discuss the peace agreement that has been ratified now by the Israeli cabinet and comes into force tomorrow morning. We'll be learning what the likelihood chances of success of that are. Plus, I'll be talking about Kemi Badenoch, who's basically seems to be going on bended knee with the Conservative Party for the next year. Not to take the knee, but to apologise for many of the failings and try and, by doing that, earn your trust. Will you ever trust the Conservatives again? She's certainly taking a long-term view about how to rebuild the party, but will that party be smashed by reform before they have a chance to regroup? They are the official opposition. How do you think they're doing? And do you think she's right to spend the next year at least basically trying to rebuild trust with you, the voter? Whew, quite a lot to get through, all that and more. Now, I'm going to come back to the state pension. And the reason is, and I fully expect you, Amy, to say that this is impossible to believe, but I get my state pension next month.
Goodness me, no, Nick, surely not.
Unbelievable.
OK, right. As convincing as any politician is what I would say there. Now, I have always been brought up in the belief in my adult life that I was going to get this state pension, and it never crossed my mind that I wouldn't. I kind of felt that I was paying national insurance, and in return for that I got certain benefits, and one of them would be the state pension. The Conservatives have come along, and in response, it was, I think, to Gordon Brown once dishing out a 25p increase one year, they introduced a thing called the triple lot, which means this year
75 or 20.
maybe it's 75p.
Not very much either way.
Not very much either way. Gordon Brown, of course, former Prime Minister and Chancellor. But Amy, this year, I can tell you exactly, the pension goes up to 11,000. I think I got my statement. £11,912. It's going to go up by another £400. We spend £135 billion from a tax take of 1,000 billion on the state pension. It's probably time to decide whether we should be continue these extreme rises in times of fiscal difficulty, isn't it?
I could not disagree more strongly. I think we started off the introduction to that by saying that, you know, if you work and you pay national insurance, I think it's you need to pay national insurance for some 30 odd years or so to qualify for that full state pension that you were talking about. So it's one of the things that it's your contribution when you're working is that you pay into national insurance, and then you know the state looks after you for a bit when you get older and you're not able to obviously to work. So the idea that then something that you might be expecting or well certainly relying upon for many people when you are getting more vulnerable as you're older, you can't work, is suddenly to be taken away, you know, breaks that contract and that promise that the state has with folk who have worked. So no, I don't. Of all the things that the state pays for, that one may be looking at in entering into again difficult financial straits, I don't think the state pension should be one of them.
Okay, well, Matthew, let's look at it this way. In reality, when the Conservative government, during the so-called years of austerity, started to tackle the pensions in the public sector, the police force is the one I used to hear most about, they basically said, right, if you're within 10 years of your pension, okay, you won't be affected. And then they graduated the changes that meant people younger were affected by the pension. What would be wrong to say to the public now, look, if you're within 10, maybe 15 years of your state pension, so you're 50 years old or over, nothing changes. You won't be means tested. But actually, for those generations coming up behind, we can't afford to chuck this money out. 135 billion, it's only going to go up. What would be wrong with that?
I think there'd be a lot wrong with it. And I have to say, in the introduction a few minutes ago, you said, I think you said, Nick, that Reform were the only party to say there'll be no change. How dare you say that when the Lib Dems have come out and said that we were the ones in coalition who introduced the triple lock and that we still believe in it now. And of course, it was, you do have to go back over a century or around a century, but it was in fact a Liberal that first introduced the state pension. So, I mean, as a Liberal and a Liberal Democrat, I absolutely believe that this should be part of the social contract for all generations. But how do we make it affordable? And dare I suggest it on this network? My choice would be a progressive taxation system where those who can afford it are charged a wee bit more to help fund public services and to help fund things like
you'd tax more but still give everyone, including people who are earning 100,000, 150,000 a year, got plenty of savings, you'd still say you get the state pension. That's madness, isn't it?
I think something like the state pension has to be for everyone. And I think it's interesting that Kemi Badenoch made this gaffe this week and then tried to claim that she hadn't made it. Well, I'm sorry, there's video evidence of what she said on a certain other radio station that we won't mention. She said it.
Amy, it's an interesting point.
She should admit that she said it.
Are these gaffes, or is it just Kemi Badenoch thinking out aloud? She did it on maternity pay when she kind of thought aloud about how we need to look at things like maternity pay. It's a bit of a risk, isn't it, that sort of approach?
Or is it a risk, or is there a certain honesty in politics? Now, I mean, politicians, along with estate agents, are the sort of least trusted professions, people in public life.
You don't think it was a gaffe?
I think we could spin on a head of a pin. I mean, if we want to go through gaffes, we could pick any number of people from any political parties, and you and I could probably have quite a to and forth about it. So I don't particularly.
No, please do.
I don't particularly want to get in.
But her team have tried to roll back, haven't they? Which makes you think it is a gaffe.
I don't want to get into a tit for tat about it. In answer to your point, Nick, you know, maybe sometimes people do speak it out. Maybe they misspeak. Maybe it's a gap. I'm not going to do the work of Kemi Badenoch's team. They can do their own sort of backspinning or whatever it is. But actually, to my more general point, and particularly actually if you're a party in opposition, why not just be a bit honest about some of the things that
because the opponents
thinking.
Leap on it, don't they?
Of course.
And suddenly then it becomes Tories want to get rid of the triple lock, or the Tories want to get rid of the state pension, and that's the danger of thinking aloud, isn't it?
Of course it is, and I think if we are talking about something as totemic as the triple lock, which absolutely the Conservatives, bound themselves to, will never get rid of it, and yes, absolutely, it was done in coalition. So Lib Dems were part of the coalition government at the same time, and indeed, Labour during the general election campaign, were also one of their manifesto sort of pledges was that they weren't going to get rid of it either. So I think in any of this debate, if there is going to be any chat from, dare I say it, the people in government, no offence to your party, no offence to indeed my own, for any chat around possibly that triple lock disappearing from the people in government, I think a lot of folk are just kind of rolling their eyes and going, well, 7 months on is just another thing that the Labour government seem to be turning themselves over on.
But as a former comms person for the Tories, I mean, how much freedom does Badenoch have or not have to think aloud? I mean, she can't do too much of that, can she?
No, I'm not saying you should. No. To go back to my point about, I think it's an honesty about some debates in politics would be a useful thing.
Well, she wants
I think
honesty,
that is slightly
of course.
different from just thinking out
I mean,
loud.
Amy is
That'd
right.
be complete chaos.
I mean, Matthew, Amy is right, because Kemi Badenoch says, I'm saying these things because I think we need honest conversations. But let's continue honest conversations here. I can see John's holding on. I'm going to take a call soon just on that subject, but I'm going to move things along. But if you want to join the conversation on, do you think the state pension should be interfered with, even means tested, and the triple lock abandoned? Because the stark truth of the matter is we now spend on state pensions £135 billion a year. What does that mean? Well, that is just that's less than the health service, but more than just about every other department, defence, education, whatever, in their individual spending. And it also means we only take taxes of about 1,000 billion in this country, and yet something like 11% of it goes on the state pension. Is that sustainable? Mel Stride, the shadow spokesman on Treasury matters, he doesn't think so. Would you support a change to the state pension? 0344 499 1000. Now, people who don't need a pension are, on the other hand, leaving the country. Labour's tax plans, according to The Times, trigger an exodus of millionaires from the UK. Now, this is basically saying a record number of millionaires have left Britain since dear old Sir Keir Starmer came to power. And there is concern that Labour's tax plans are exiling international investors and damaging the economy. This is all in part because of the crackdown on the non-domiciled residents, which was a change promised by Labour, and they've implemented it. But it's also the inheritance tax rules from the last budget, driving people out of this country who are not just paying taxes, right? Maybe not as much as people want, but also spending shed loads of money here. I suppose you support this nonsense, do you?
Crimea River. I mean, give me the smallest violin available.
Why?
You know.
Why
Hoo,
though,
hoo,
Matthew?
bye-bye. You know,
Why?
Off you go.
Why? Why do you want to kiss goodbye to money that's going to go to France and go elsewhere?
If they think that little of this country, that because they're being asked to pay a wee bit more...
A wee bit more?
Do you know
how
they're
much
going
it is?
to... Well, I'm sure you'll tell me now.
Well, no, what I will tell you is how much we're going to lose through this, the potential loss, right, which the Treasury would turn around and say, oh, it's only 836 million, right? Okay. Right. But the reality is that takes no account for what we spend when these people buy education, go to retail, spend on accommodation, spend in this country. You and I do. We are basically closing the door on rich people who, frankly, are just going to go and pay less tax elsewhere.
Well, my concern is with people at the other end of the economic scale, people in poverty, and action for them to help them. My concern is not with people who are a bit upset because they're being asked to pay.
Those people help pay for those at the other end that you're worried about.
Well, they should pay more.
So nothing. Let's get rid of them. They're not paying enough. It's a bit inconsistent, isn't it?
It's not inconsistent at all. Labour seem to be saying, and me and Amy would perhaps agree on this, that Labour seem to be saying that they can be both fiscally responsible, as they put it, and in their view not put up any taxes, although obviously they are doing, and have better public services. You can't do both. You've got to say how you fund public services.
Yeah. Well, so this was so I entirely agree with your point. Like, if you want healthier, wealthier, better educated, Britain, I think everybody from any political party agrees with that. Well, if they don't, it's a nonsense. So there's that. We all agree on that. But then, yes, there are issues around how you pay for it. So the excess of millionaires is a big problem for Labour, because if we remember back in June, July in the general election campaign, they're taxing non-doms more fairly, sort of seem to be paying for everything. I mean, that was how a lot of Labour's spending plans, in terms of improving transport or education or housing or any of these other things, as I say, everyone would
wasn't it going to fund? I thought it was something they were going to fund school fees or something.
No, it was VAT on public school fees.
That's right.
And taxing non-doms were the two things that in every interview ever given by the now government were going to be the thing, the pot of money that was going to pay for suddenly the country being, sunny uplands of all these better public services, etc., etc. So this is a big problem for Labour, in that one of these pots of money, whether we even believe that it was going to be able to fund all the things that it was promising,
which it clearly wasn't. Well, they just leave. And guess what? 10,800 have left.
Well, and there we go. And I think there is a the story that's on the front page of the Times today. It is that kind of wider point of, and again, I think people from most political parties do agree that those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burden, which is
certainly the Conservatives do on their record.
Which is the phrase that I think all political parties use these days. So again, I don't particularly want to get into minutiae of tax levels and exactly where the burden should fall, but I think the general principle of those who can afford more should have paid more. But with this, Nick, as you said, millionaires here, let's not get into debate about the tax system, as I say, but they do spend a lot in terms of retail, entertainment, housing, just dare I say it, there's all, trickle down.
Yeah.
So suddenly...
It's very London-centric,
I was about
but
to say,
it's there.
particularly in somebody like London, but actually,
doesn't
Manchester...
trickle down to the poorest, though,
no,
does
but
it?
Manchester, well, actually...
They remain poor.
No,
why is that?
May I just press you on that?
And why are they never raised?
A lot of people actually who work in retail or the service, restaurants, bars, and all the rest of it. Yes, it is exactly those kind of places where people on, minimum wage at £11.44 or national London living wage being a little more. It's exactly kind of people who work in retail and entertainment, restaurant services, bars, nightclubs, etc. But they are exactly the ones who are in London.
Trap?
I mean, that's a slightly different question, but in terms of the trickle down and exactly whose jobs may be dependent
but let's turn that question
on
back to
people
Matthew.
Spending money in those places.
Have any of the taxation policies that have been introduced over the last 20 years actually worked when it comes to poverty gap? Of course not. You're picking on non-doms. It's ideological what you're doing. Why don't you just say, come on, fess up, I don't like rich people?
I actually, on this, agree with, was it Peter Mandelson, dare I say it, when I think he said, and they only ever quote the first bit, when he said, I have no problem with the filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. And what I'd say is I'd question the patriotism of these people. They've been asked to pay a wee bit more. They've been very, very hugely successful.
But they're not British, most of them. They're not British. So how can you question their patriotism? They're just moving around the world. Capital and rich people can move around easily, and they can go and pay legally the minimum amount of tax in the country they wish to choose to live in. That's what's wrong with that, Matthew?
Well, indeed. I say bye-bye, off you go.
Fine. There you go. That's how it. So the Lib Dems will not be welcoming.
I don't speak on. I'm not an official spokesperson.
I'll
just my views.
I'll keep pretending you are. Right. We're going to take a break in a minute, but let me just remind you what the question is. I can see the calls are coming in. I will get to those. How do you feel about ending the triple lock on pensions? And why? And what about means testing it? That means not everyone would get it. Interesting. And don't forget, 2019, we legally Brexited. Some say we didn't, but we legally Brexited. It's 5 years at the end of January. How do you feel about Brexit? Has it been a success, or are you disappointed? 0344 499 1000. Stay here. More from Matthew Hulbert and Amy Fisher, former Director of Comms at the Conservative Party, going through the top stories of the day.
The roads in London might be one thing, but if you get outside London, they're even worse. the thing to do is to make sure that the government is going to fund local authorities properly to repair these roads, rather than what's happening at the moment. They're having to scrimp and save. They fill in the potholes as best they can. Some do a good job, some don't. But I think what will infuriate your listeners in a number of areas of the country is they put in the tarmac into these potholes, and 2 or 3 months later they come out again because they haven't done a proper job.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. I'm here with Matthew Horber, Lib Dem activist, who insists he's not speaking for the Lib Dems, but I'm just ignoring that, and you can too. Let's imagine he is. And Amy Fisher, former Director of Comms at the Conservative Party. But we're going to be joined on the conversation now by John in Bradford. John, you'd like to talk about pensions?
Well, yes. I mean, I've been on a pension for a few years now, and I've paid into it over 50 years. So I think it would be disastrous for any party to support stopping it. But can I just come on to another subject, which is what your Liberal Democrat person on there was talking about?
Matthew, yes.
The Liberal Democrats are being anti-democratic because they want to take the UK back into the EU. Now, if they did that, would we get the £29 billion that we paid in to come out? That's number one. Look at the state of Germany's economy, which was one of the strongest economies in Europe, is now a basket case. So why the hell would you want to go back into an organisation that's failing? And if they do want to go back into the EU, then they should have a referendum and not just decide to throw the decision out of the window.
It's absolutely true, isn't it, John, that people talk about Brexit and judge it on the fact that, you know, what's happened since we've left. But of course, you've also got to make the calculation, well, what would it have been like had we remained? Now, that's speculative, but you're quite right. You know, in defence of this government, last year we had the best growth of all the EU countries in the G7. So I think you make a perfectly legitimate point. On the pension, John, do you have any sense, though, that 135 billion, which of course is about 11-12% of how much we collect in taxes, that this is sustainable? Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor for the Conservatives, has said that continuing to have the triple lock, which imposes rises of probably foreseeably for at least 2.5%, if not more, for the next few years. Is that really sustainable?
Well, I would say that you know, they could use it on a basis of increasing it with the rate of inflation and not the average earnings. I would probably tolerate that. But the main thing we've got to think about is this government is giving away about 50 to 60 billion pounds to other countries for all sorts of reasons. And if they cut the civil service by 30%, right, they would have enough money to double the pension and finance a lot of the other things that the country needs. It's all this money that's been thrown out of the window, and Labour's typical Labour. They use our money like confetti at a wedding. You just throw it all over the place, and they don't look at what they're spending.
All politicians need to think of it as their money. They might be more respectful of it. John, thanks for kicking off the conversation. Amy, basically, it's a bit of an indictment in some sense of the Conservatives, is that the civil service grew, the costs of the state grew.
I just want to pick up on a point that John made just at the end, because it was one I made earlier, which is, I literally said, of all the things that the government is spending money on and where savings need to be made, because we cannot deny we're still in slightly straitened financial circumstances, of all the things the government spends money on, I don't think it should be the state pension that they are looking at to make savings from. So, you know, 1 in 4 adults of working age in this country do not work. Now that, you know, so I'm talking essentially then again about the wider benefits budget. So there are things there that we should be looking at about why is the country as a whole not more productive? Why do we not have more people in work? Not just, as I say, for the impact it would have on the bottom line of the benefits budget, but people being in work has enormous benefits for the
failing.
for the
Amy, I mean,
individual
I love your optimism, but they're failing. The idea that Labour are going to get people back
being
into
optimistic,
work.
so I'll take that.
I mean, your optimism that we can get people back to work when all we see we're the worst in Europe for getting people back to work post-COVID.
Well,
the idea that we're going to cut the benefits bill, you know, it's just a joke.
But the point I was also making there is it's not just about cutting the benefits bill in and of itself, although that is actually very important in terms of government expenditure. But there are enormous benefits to the individual and indeed wider society when people are in work. You know, they feel better about themselves, and it's the self-confidence, being able to provide for themselves, and all the rest of it. So,
but they're still joining up in droves.
If we're talking about
benefits.
big bits of government spending, I would rather the government really, and it has said it's going to do so, I would really rather it looked at some of those reasons why we have people of working age being entirely economically inactive, which is a tragedy for the individual and their family and the wider
really
society.
Good point. But I'm reading, Matthew, 3,000 people a day are joining the sickness and benefits bill. I mean, this is just madness.
And that's a problem. But what I'd say, and you can call this wishy-washy as much as you want, it's my
probably
point.
will.
It's all right,
You probably
I've already been
will.
called optimistic.
It's my point of view that we should treat these people as individuals, and that DWP.
What does that mean? Give them more money?
And it doesn't necessarily mean that, but what it does mean is I've had, thankfully, brief a couple, and it's been years and years ago now, but I've had brief periods of being out of work and having to claim. I hated it and took any job that was available to get out of that situation. Not everyone is able to do that.
But that mentality doesn't exist, I don't believe.
No, but it's been slightly easier for me. I'm not married. I have no children. Why
should being married stop you getting a job?
No, it doesn't. But what I mean is, I have very few responsibilities to others, and so I've been able to just take any job and be able to do that. So, but not everyone is able to do that. But what I would say is that when I went to the job centre, etc., you were treated as if you weren't human, and I think that is wrong. I think you should be treated as a human being and be given.
Well, let me give everyone some really good
advice.
Don't rely on the job centre.
Well, I agree.
Rely on your own initiative. Rely on that ability to go out and pump out 300 CVs and applications.
But then why do we have job centres?
And so,
Nick, I think that's. I remember getting my first job at 15 or something. A waitressing job. Well, I didn't know where to start, so of course I went to the job centre.
And how do you think you were treated?
Again.
So it's said on card. No, I'm actually sort of joking. But my point is, when you're getting your first job, you don't.
Hang on, if you're talking about getting a job in Waitrose, you go down either to your Waitrose and ask for jobs.
Waitressing was where
waitressing.
Waitress.
Oh my God, hang on, there's adverts at doors when you walk down the high street.
But also, Nick, let's be honest, and this won't be for everyone. There will be some who are trying to game the system, and they should be dealt with. I don't claim otherwise, and my party doesn't. But I also think there are others who have mental health issues, who have physical health issues, who have all sorts of family situations. They should be treated as individuals, and their set of circumstances looked at. Well, I don't think they are. I think the people at DWP are told, do whatever you can to get these people back into work, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of their mental health state or whatever it is. And they become numbers, not human
the much
beings.
admittedly talked about and not necessarily well work capability assessment scheme. We now know that actually there's advice on the internet what keywords to say for your telephone interview that gets you off on mental illness. Right?
Well, I mean,
so we know the system is also being scammed, not by everyone, I hasten to add. But this is the huge task of the government, which is why I know I accused you of being optimistic, and you're talking about getting these people back to work. But we have a benefit system at the moment that is actually designed to support people on benefits and not get them back to work. And Ian Duncan Smith tried it in the Conservative government. Others have tried it. Liz Kendall, the current Social Security Minister, effectively, has said she's going to succeed. I don't share your optimism because I think it's failed. Listen, we're going to have to move on because I've got Herbie from Harrow. Then we're going to talk Donald Trump. Herbie, thanks for calling.
No problem, Nick. Nick, the problem is that the government is overburdened with civil servants that are not producing anything but are costing the state money. The pensioners can only survive if money's put back into the economy and it can produce what we need to produce. At the moment, is completely out of control. There's nobody guiding the government of how to spend money and how to make it work. There's nobody with any idea of what is needed to be done, and it's just completely out of control. Completely.
I mean, what do you think the answer is to getting, and I'm moving the subject on a little bit, Herbie, to here. You know, we're facing, from the discussion we've just had here, a huge number of people who are not working, right? And that bill is increasing every day. More and more people than in any other European country post-COVID in Britain.
Well, hence the benefit, hence the benefits, Nick.
So what do you do? Do you basically stop them and say you can't continue to have them or cut them in half?
Nick, it's an impossible situation at the moment because they've been able to get away with it by living off the state like they're doing. They're nice and comfortable. They don't, if they're going on the black market as well, which a lot of them do. You know, they're making more money than anything else. The problem is that nobody is controlling anything. The system is completely out of control. You know, the illegal immigrants are costing us daily more money. Where's the money coming from? We're supposed to have no money.
Well, we're borrowing it, and that's getting more expensive. We're having to borrow more and more and more.
Yeah, but Nick, where's this magic money tree that the government's got? Why are we supporting the rest of the world? When we're in trouble, can you see any other nation coming and giving us money and helping us out? Of course not. You know, we are the mugs of the world. We really are. And we got on it across our forehead. Stupid people.
Herbie, you make some very passionate points there, and some points I know a lot of people are going to identify with. Thank you very much for doing that. I did say we were going to talk Donald Trump. I'm getting yelled at to go to a break, so we're going to do a break. Then we're going to talk about Donald Trump. Hey, Donald Trump is going to be president in 2 days. Now, I know this is very much on the minds of an awful lot of people, and I'm curious. Keir Starmer seems to think he's got a really good relationship with him, and it's going to be a very fruitful relationship between the UK and the US under Donald Trump. Do you think he's on cloud cuckoo land, or have his efforts to, if you like, charm and impress the new president, Donald Trump, give us a fighting chance, perhaps, of avoiding those tariffs that seem to be coming down the road and making a working relationship? Who knows, getting a trade agreement with America, something the last Conservative government failed to do. 03444 499 1000. I'll be talking about that with Matthew Halbert, Lib Dem activist, and Amy Fisher, former Director of Communications, a former optimistic Director of Communications for the Conservative Party. 03444 499 1000.
Across the UK, on DAB+, On your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
0344 499 1000 is the number. You can either WhatsApp or you can call me to join me and my guests to discuss the questions of the day. How do you feel about ending the triple lock on pensions? Maybe even means testing it. And remember, and we'll be talking about this shortly, 5 years since we officially Brexited. How do you feel about that? Disappointed? Pleased? Regrets? Je ne regrette rien. 0344 499 1000. OK. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he's told the Financial Times he will have a constructive relationship with incoming US President Donald Trump. In a lengthy interview with the paper, he also dismissed Elon Musk's criticisms of his leadership as noises off, whatever that means. So, are we destined for a bright future with America? Will Keir Starmer get a trade deal with America, something Boris Johnson failed to do?
Well, I mean, you could scarcely expect Starmer to say anything different, of course.
Do you think David Lammy was sort of looking forward to the next 4 years? Because he had a lot to say about Donald Trump.
There were no words as David Lammy and a number of other people in government who were not too shy about talking of Trump and some of his very legitimate and obvious failings and difficulties with various court cases, etc. However, you know, albeit sort of convicted of various things, he is now about to be the leader of the free world and the most powerful man in the world. So, of course, Starmer is playing nice. I personally think, because Starmer and Trump had that sort of tete-a-tete dinner.
They had a dinner together at Mar-a-Lago, wasn't it?
I would give my eye teeth to have been on a fly on the wall for that, because Starmer's so sort of he doesn't seem to me like a man who makes sort of easy conversation.
You wouldn't go down the pub for a drink with him, would you?
No, he's not one for a sort of natter.
But can it work? Is there enough motivation between the US and the UK for them to if you like, put aside
nicely with each other?
Yeah.
You know, look, I think Trump is of the ego and narcissistic nature that he is, and I think Starmer is, you know, quite good at just being the rather sort of, actually it means particularly pejoratively, the sort of bland, you know, doesn't rile easily, doesn't seem to have a massive ego of his own. So I think in that sense it need not be a clash in the same way that sort of Trump and say Boris Johnson might have been, or you know, Trump and even Macron, you know, when they had that famous who's going to out handshake each other and be more macho and squeeze.
That was weird.
Yeah, I mean, it was very weird.
It was really weird.
But the point I'm trying to make is I don't think Starmer, he's not that sort of character that feels the need to play those sorts of...
He is a bank manager, really, isn't he? He just wants to, you know, a bit Rishi Sunak in a way.
Here we are, let's have a meeting. I've got my list of aims to get out of it, and we'll just sort of sit here and have some, you know, slightly
character
matters,
Matthew, and if you don't hit it off with someone, you're probably going to be less likely to want to help them out, aren't you? And I just can't see it working.
You are. I mean, of course, part of me would love to see, you know, in an ideal world, a British Prime Minister to stand up and say, I'm not going to have anything to do with this man, he's a convicted felon, he's blah, blah, blah. But the realpolitik is that we've got to have a relationship with the United States. And so he's saying what he has to say.
Yeah, but hang on. Let's just have a little think about what you said there. I want a British Prime Minister to stand up and say they want nothing to do with...
A Love Actually moment, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but I don't think it is a Love Actually
A West Wing moment.
I know what you're talking about, but he's a convicted felon, and yet are you quite happy to see Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, go shaking hands with the leader of a country that has a terrible record on the treatment of the Uyghurs and their freedoms and attacks on liberties?
It's the realpolitik, isn't it? It's... I mean, again, in an ideal world, I'd prefer not to see her go and do that.
Who would you prefer? Xi, President Xi of China, or Donald Trump as our best mate?
I mean, what an option!
So glad you got that question.
I mean, you know, neither of them. I'd rather we were shaking.
You're going to be a very
I'd rather
country,
we were shaking more hands in the European Union. That's what I wish we were doing. But we're going to come on to that. So
well, okay. But the reality is, you cannot, and Donald Trump, doesn't he? Keir Starmer, he wants his cake and eat it. He wants a good trading relationship with China and a great relationship with America. That's not what Donald Trump's really got in mind. His relationship with China is going to be put to the test. He's threatening tariffs, isn't he?
Yeah.
Do you think we'll get caught up in those tariffs?
as far as I can make out, Trump is sort of threatening tariffs to everyone, and also is going to make Canada another state of
he loves
state.
tariffs, if we're to believe him.
I think as with Trump in anything that he says about anything and everything, a lot of how much of it is smoke and mirrors and noise and trumpeting, no puns intended.
Are you dreading his first day? I am. All the things he said he was going to do on the first day. Now, was that all just rhetoric, or will he try and do a whole load of stuff on his first day of proper administration?
Maybe this is me being overly optimistic again. Trump is the showman, right? And there's the good part of that, which made him the kind of Trump is good at what he does. I am not saying I agree
He's
or
putting his
like
country
what
first.
Trump does.
Most people are going to find that attractive.
Is he?
Good.
Yes, he is.
And there's the whole MAGA, make America great again. That's why he won so overwhelmingly in states that had previously sort of been very blue. So Trump is good at what Trump does, the showmanship. I think there is, and with anybody who's good at sort of performance, there's a percentage of it that is just the performance. It's the noise and it's the glitz and the sound.
But Amy, is there a political basis there that underlies that? Because Trump used to be, you go back into his history, he used to be a Clinton-esque, Democrat.
Sure.
A bit like Boris Johnson. He'll say whatever he wants to say if it gets him where he wants to be.
Which is part of being Trump, exactly. That's part of the whole performance bit of it. So, no, I cannot claim to understand what any of the sort of actual political core of him is, because that's what I was trying to get at.
I think it's all about negotiation,
is the performance
though,
and how much is the
deal?
I think he's basically saying, I'm going to tax you all to the hilt, and then that's his opening position in a negotiation. But can Starmer really avoid tariffs on Britain, do you think?
Oh, it is. I think, sort of going back to the personality of the two men, I think if Trump just sort of views Starmer as not a kind of threat in any way. I actually don't mean in obviously a geopolitical or military way. I just mean as like not a threat. If Trump is picking all these, macro and micro battles with Europe, China, whoever else, if Britain and Starmer is just sort of there, just kind
we
of...
might not irritate him enough to cause him to focus on
Things are kind of going okay, so Britain and Starmer are just over here.
That's the Starmer foreign policy strategy for America, as outlined by Amy there, which has, by the way, some element of truth in that, I suspect. John, in Dorset, you'd like to talk about Donald Trump. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, I did a little check just after I spoke to your producer. Apparently, it's not routine for any of the inaugurations that the British PM attends, but they usually sort of visit shortly afterwards. But Lammy hasn't been invited, Mandelson hasn't been invited, and he's going to be the next ambassador. Now, they may have been invited, or have there been back channels to say, well, we ought to invite you, but it might be a good idea to find something else?
Trump is definitely inviting his buddies. But listen, I might surprise you with this. I'll be interested in what our guests say. But first of all, you, John, for all my sort of opposition to Peter Mandelson, what he stood for during the Blair years and so forth, I never underestimated him as an operator. I think he could actually be a very important and positive influence on our relationship with the UK and Trump. Funny enough, I've got some hope there. What do you think? Am I flying in the dark there?
I would. Well, you're a politician. You know the inside circuit better than I, Nick. But I would suggest that Mandelson did say once he didn't have a problem. He was quite relaxed about being people being filthy rich.
I quoted that earlier.
But he's deeply embedded with Russian oligarchs, which may or may not work in his favour.
Well, that is true. He and George Osborne were on a boat together, I seem to remember somewhere, weren't they? John, listen, for time reasons only, great call, got us talking. Now, I guess I want to ask you kind of the same question there. A yes or no, if I could, for time reasons only. But Peter Mandelson, good choice as ambassador?
Yes.
Very good.
We have agreement. 03444 99 1000 is the number to join the conversation. And more of that coming up. And Brexit, 5 years on. Here with me, Nick de Bois. 03444 499 1000.
the Sun newspaper was better at monitoring an offender in the community than the probation service.
And better at detective work, seemingly.
Yes. How on earth can that be, that we have a national newspaper that supervises somebody in the community better than the probation service? A convicted killer, no less. All praise to the Sun newspaper, all of shame to the probation service.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
January the 29th, 2019, we left the European Union. Many of us had spent a lifetime with that ambition and goal. Many others found themselves bereft at the result of the referendum back in 2016. Did you know? I can't even remember that. It was 16, wasn't it? Yeah, 2016. Well, we're 5 years on now, and one of the things many people would have said to you when criticism was coming in about the eventual Brexit deal was it will take years before we know whether it's been successful or not. And indeed, it probably still will take years to know if we've been successful or not. But it seems an appropriate moment, not least because I won't be here on January the 29th, for us to ask, has Brexit been a success? Are you disappointed or are you pleased? 0344 499 1000. And that is precisely the question I'm going to put to, with some sense of knowing what's coming, Matthew Hulbert, Lib Dem activist.
Well, I mean, of course, I'm very sad. I mean, I think it was the greatest act of self-harm in many a long year for our country, but it was how people voted, so you know it is what it is. But I'm not an economist, but what I hear from economists whenever I see them on the TV is that thus far at least none of the wonderful things that we were promised by the Brexiteers have come to be. So what I'm told is that it's been a bit of a disaster, and of course I'm not surprised that that's the case.
Amy, how do you feel?
Okay, so whilst you say that none of the wonderful things that the economists promised have come to be, I'd push back on that and say, well, the skies didn't fall in either. And I actually say that as somebody who voted Remain, by the way. So I think at this point I'm just sort of profoundly bored by the fact that we're still debating whether there should be a reverse of Brexit or not. Because again, as you said, look, it was a democratic vote. People voted to leave. As I say, I happen to vote to Remain, but that's what a democracy is. The country spoke, we left, the sky has not, as I can make out, fallen in. There has been no plague of locusts. It's probably still going to take another few years yet to really see what the outcome is. But
democracy didn't end there, did it? And if it had gone the other way, do you really think that the Brexiteers would have said, well, OK, Remain have won, well done Remain, we're going to focus on something? Of course they wouldn't have. They'd have carried on their campaign to leave.
I take your point. You know, let's take another democracy, i.e., you know, changes of government in this country. We have one every 5 years. So are you seriously saying that we should rerun a Brexit vote every 5 years?
No, but I think eventually there should be one. And Lib Dem policy actually is that eventually we should rejoin, but we're talking about quite a long time. But what Ed Davey said this week, and I was pleased to see it from my party leader, was that there should be a new customs union arrangement between the UK and the EU. And I think that's just economic common sense. And the Brexiteers may, you know, shake their fist at it, but it's just sense.
I won't shake my fist at you, I promise, but let's just have a look at the economic common sense of it. So I don't know specifically what he's talking about, because the customs union is quite a unique arrangement to have now when they have the full single market and obviously full membership of the Turkey, for example.
I worked in the Northern Ireland office and trying to work out exactly border crossings and where the border was in the state. I mean, that it's not... I appreciate your political point about what Amy said, but sort of we're almost seeing some kind of renegotiation of custody is.
And you're quite right. And let's keep it
thing.
top line, because basically Ed Davey wants the country to rejoin the EU. Okay, so I think that's a distraction.
All right position to take, isn't it?
But you said because of the economic failures. How do you explain then, for example, post-COVID? Post-Ukraine, well, not post-Ukraine, obviously post the huge impact of Ukraine, but hopefully in the final stages of Ukraine. Last year, we had the fastest growing economy in the G7 of EU countries. And curiously enough, and I don't quote the IMF very often because they're often wrong, they're saying that will possibly be the case in 2025 as well.
And I don't mean to sort of pile onto you, Matthew, but there has been a very frightening lurch to the right in quite a lot of Europe. So the fact that we're not sort of bound to some quite scary political things that are happening there, because of the many criticisms I would make of the current government, I don't think they've got any sense of being mad fascists about them. So I'm glad we're not to be bound into that.
I tell you what, though, but there's someone who wants.
Thank goodness for that.
There is someone who wants us to return to the European Union, who is bound to all these strange parties out there in Europe. Not himself, of course. I'm talking about former president of the EU Council at the time of Brexit, Donald Tusk, now Prime Minister of Poland, where Keir Starmer visited only, I think it was yesterday. And watch Keir Starmer squirm as you watch and listen to what Donald Tusk had to say about the future of Britain and the EU.
I am aware this is a dream of mine, that instead of a Brexit, we will have a Britain. Perhaps I am labouring under an illusion. I'd rather be an optimist and harbour these dreams in my heart. Sometimes they come true in politics. But of course, we need the maximum rapprochement of Great Britain and the European Union.
It's interesting, isn't it? The European Union, or at least Donald Tusk there, he'd welcome us back. And actually, I didn't think there was any humility when we came out 5 years ago from the European Union asking themselves, how was it that their wonderful dream of the EU was so bad that they lost their second most powerful economic force who voted to leave it? They never even questioned that. They just decided to punish us, didn't they?
Well, I think that's sort of understandable in the sense that, you know, if one part chooses to leave another sort of still coalesced entity, of course the coalesced entity is going to have the groupthink of, well, those guys have decided to gone off. They must be the ones who are wrong. So in that sense, I kind of
well, I think a bit of humility might have actually helped us all. But yeah, I take your point.
Where's the humility from the Brexiteers? Where's their humility?
Oh well, I'll give you a very good
Where's
example.
Your humility?
Of course, no, the humility was very well said. Steve Baker actually said it as a former negotiator. I was in the negotiating room when I was working with Dominic Raab, and we've always said we underestimated the unity of the EU and their unity of purpose. We've been very clear about that, and I think Steve Baker showed that humility very much so when it was there. But shall I tell you what I think's been the most successful thing about Brexit? And it's what I voted on. It was the democratic accountability. No government in the UK had anywhere to hide. Boris Johnson's government had nowhere to hide. Rishi Sunak had nowhere to hide. They were punished by the voters. In the past, they've been able to point to Europe and say, but they did that, they did that. That's a good thing. We choose our government with no interference, Matthew. That's what a Democrat is.
That is just about the only good thing that I think we got out of Brexit. I'd return to the EU tomorrow personally, but I think it's going to be probably
Listen, I have to thank you both now. We're coming to the top of the hour. Matthew Halbert, Lib Dem activist, Amy Fisher, former Director of Comms at the Conservative Party. Thanks so much for a brilliant first hour and welcoming me back, all my rusty self. Coming up at the top of the hour, we will have Alistair Burt, former Middle East Minister, talking to us about the latest on the Israel-Gaza ceasefire. And you can join me on 0344 499 1000 here with me, Nick de Bois, on Talk Radio. That and lots more coming up. And most importantly, I want to hear from you here on Talk.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This
Thank you for all your calls this morning. We just had a fast-paced hour there discussing some of the top stories. We didn't even get to them all, but one that has taken up a lot of interest is the future of the state pension. I don't think it's as simple as and straightforward, actually, as saying, no, we should keep it as it is, we should keep the triple lock. The fact is, the bill is already 135 billion of a total of 1,000 billion that we take in taxes. It's only going to go up. So I think it's legitimate to have a conversation about whether it should be means tested, i.e., meaning depending on how much you earn, should you get it, should it be reduced? But I also equally understand the sense of injustice many people feel because they don't see it as a benefit, and rightly so. They see it as something that they have paid for throughout their working lives. I'm really interested in your views on this. I found absolutely staunch defence of keeping the state pension and the triple lock, that mechanism to guarantee a significant uplift every year. But share your views with me on 0344 499 1000. Now I'm going to talk to, obviously, the major international news regarding the now agreed Gaza ceasefire, which begins on Sunday morning after it was approved by the Israeli government. And it actually begins, I think it's 8:30 local time, which is 6:30 GMT on Sunday morning. It comes after the Israeli government formally approved the deal on late Friday. We've had confirmation from the office of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the Security Cabinet meeting had begun in Jerusalem, and at that point on it looked very much like it was going to be a done deal. The question is, what is that deal going to look like and how is it going to work? Israel has said 3 hostages will be released initially, with 33 hostages will be released initially over this first period of 42 days, because this ceasefire is literally a roadmap towards getting a settlement, an agreement that will eventually lead to the rebuilding of Gaza. But that is no simple task. So in the immediate term, there's going to be a release of some Israeli hostages and a correspondingly but much higher number of release of Palestinian people who are held in the prisons in return. It's been quite a struggle to get over the line, but I think it's going to be potentially more of a struggle to actually complete the deal, which, as I say, will take place over a series of stages. We've even got an Israeli cabinet minister saying that when the first stage ends in 6 weeks, they hope that Israel will go back on the offensive in Gaza to ensure Hamas are wiped out. Hamas, of course, the group that launched the terror attack on Israel October the 7th, now 15 months ago, killing so many people. Joining me is an absolute expert on the subject and former Minister for the Middle East, Alistair Burt. Welcome, Alistair. Good to have you on the show.
Good morning, Nick. Nice to see you again.
Alistair, I suppose my first question is, this has been an incredibly difficult deal to get across the line, and it strikes me as it's very, very tenuous, and that it could face some severe challenges for this deal to get right through to the end stage, which would be a more positive age of trying to even rebuild Gaza from the devastating attacks it's obviously undergone. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. If you look at how difficult it has been to get to this stage and how many blocks have been put in the way, it's not unreasonable to think that those who have held up a deal in the past for various reasons on each side might be so uncertain about what has been agreed that they would want to pursue their aims and disregard the ceasefire in due course. But balancing that is firstly the incredible weariness of those involved in a conflict, which often leads to the end of the conflict, the horror on both sides, the horror of Israeli families after October the 7th and waiting for the return of their loved ones, the massive destruction in Gaza that has devastated it and killed tens of thousands, the pressure on those who lead in both Israel and amongst the Palestinians is intense to stop what has been happening, return the hostages, end the bombing of Gaza. And those pressures have combined now, after so long, to create the agreement. But those who perpetuated the conflict, kept it going when there was a potential deal on the table, have not gone away. And it is possible that the deal may not hold. But most of the rest of the world and those who have been working so hard to put the deal together, not least, of course, the people who've been involved and suffered for the last 468 days, they want this to hold.
One of the criticisms being levelled by members of Benjamin Netanyahu's own cabinet, he of course being the Prime Minister of Israel, is that his pledge was he would eradicate Hamas from Gaza. And the argument is that this deal means that won't be the case. Is this a tough pill for the Prime Minister of Israel to swallow? And I suppose, why has he swallowed it? Is it just he knows the population are weary of war?
I'm sure it is a tough realisation for him that the aims he set out at the beginning of the conflict were never going to be realised. Virtually every commentator outside Israel told Prime Minister Netanyahu that his aim of destroying Hamas completely was unlikely, because you could kill a number of those who've been involved in the terrorist attack, and you could kill a number of those who are militants, but you couldn't kill the ideology behind Hamas. And the likelihood of recovering all the hostages by force of arms was also unlikely, and that has proved the case. The majority of hostages that have been freed since October the 7th have been freed by negotiation. And as Secretary of State Blinken said just last week, the United States reckons that as many Hamas new recruits have been collected by Hamas as those who have perished in the conflict. So neither aim was likely. So Prime Minister Netanyahu has been brought face to face with reality, largely by President Trump and the outgoing Biden administration, to appreciate, as you can't actually achieve your war aims, maybe there is a different way to pursue, quite rightly, the security of the State of Israel and end the conflict.
He's obviously come under quite a lot of influence from incoming President Donald Trump on agreeing to this deal. I suppose the question, though, is he still faces, we are told, quite a challenge from within his own government, not necessarily to get this across the line, but to perhaps sustain him in government. And does his survival, or does this peace agreement actually depend on his continuance in government, do you think? Or in Israel, are all other parties behind this deal?
It's a very complex picture in Israeli politics. There has been a growing nationalist, very hard right-wing element that has come into government because Prime Minister Netanyahu couldn't, after the last election, secure a majority without them. Those are Ministers Smotrich and Minister Ben-Gvir. They are very unhappy with the deal because it doesn't suggest a way forward for what they see as the future of Israel. Other parties want to see an end of the conflict. Everyone is worried about the compromises involved and the concern over whether or not hostages will eventually be released and everything else. My understanding is that Prime Minister Netanyahu's position isn't immediately threatened. He will have to face elections in due course. If the government collapses, that would put a different complexion on it, and he might not be secure. But his own personal standing has varied a lot. It dropped through the floor after the attack and the consideration of what part had been played by Israel in allowing the atrocious attack on October the 7th, how it had managed to happen, and then the conduct of the war. But his support picked up considerably after the devastating attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran, which dealt with significant threats from there. But of course, his own survival is also tied up with the personal issues he has in relation to the corruption trials. And there are those commentators in Israel who believe that his determination to keep the war going was partly his determination to see it through in the manner which he had set out to the Israeli people, and partly because he fears that when the war comes to an end, then the inquiries will begin and he will face justice through the courts. But in a way, important though that is, the most important thing is what is happening in Gaza, what has happened to the people of Gaza, and what has happened to the hostage families. And at the moment, that should dominate all our thoughts. That's what the effort has been in the past few weeks by the negotiators of the US, Egypt and Qatar to get where we are. And I think it's really important that that is seen through to end the misery for those who are involved. And who knows, with those first steps taken, maybe there is a prospect of the ceasefire holding, and then we can think about the future of Israel, Palestine and the region.
Well, it's interesting you say that, and I totally understand why you are saying we must think of the people who've just literally had their lives torn apart, and they're rebuilding, and their future is obviously what is most important. Just the first question I've got around that is there anything in this ceasefire that acknowledges that at the end of it, Israel could still have a neighbour that is a serious threat to it? Or are these issues that will be agreed to be discussed? Because how do you reassure Israel that this could never happen again after Gaza is rebuilt?
I think those issues are next. I think because they're based in a long, complex history in the region. Trying to settle them at the same time as the ceasefire was going to be very unlikely. But everyone knows that they are the next things to be considered for just the point that you have raised. Everyone deserves security. The people of Gaza need to know that after this is not the first incursion into Gaza, after many years of attacks on Gaza, they need to know that they're safe. And Israel quite rightly has to know that there is no likelihood of a return to October the 7th. But what is worth posing to people in the region is Israel's security determined by preventing a Palestinian state, which quite obviously has been the government's policy for as long as Prime Minister Netanyahu has been there, has not delivered security to the people of Israel at all. So maybe there's another way. Maybe it is the way set out by Foreign Minister Safadi of Jordan at the UN in September, saying there are 57 Arab states ready and determined to protect Israel and ensure its safety behind a border next to a Palestinian state. And the cry has always been a safe and secure Israel next to a secure and viable Palestinian state. That hasn't been tried. Maybe that's a way to get the security that everyone is looking for, rather than go back to where we've been and absolutely ensure that the embers of conflict will rise again. There are calculated to be some 17,000 orphans in Hamas. Where are they going to go in 10 years' time if the politics haven't been resolved? It's time to try something different.
And is it important that when it comes to the reconstruction and indeed any next stage agreements that are worked up dealing with security in particular are owned by the region rather than dominated by the West?
That's absolutely right, Nick. We have played our part. We have tried over the years. If you look at Camp David, the Oslo Accords, John Kerry's efforts that concluded in 2014, we've been an integral part of all the efforts to try and secure peace, to try and talk with both Israel and the Palestinian representatives to try and get a solution. Nothing has held, nothing has worked. What has changed over the years is the rise of the Gulf states in particular to join the older Arab states of Egypt and Jordan, who've always had a keen interest in what has happened, and indeed, of course, have had their own peace agreements with Israel for a long time. But the economic power of the Gulf is essential if Gaza is to be rebuilt. And let's be quite clear about it. They're going to put no money into rebuilding Gaza if it's going to be bombed again in 6 months, 12 months, 3 years' time. There won't be a rebuilt Gaza unless there is an absolute assurance that this is not going to happen again. And Saudi Arabia's position is key. Israel very much wants to see its position with Saudi Arabia normalised, as is the phrase. It wants to be an integral part of the Middle East, and it should be. But the price of that normalisation has changed in the last 15 months. It's now very clearly the acceptance of a Palestinian state by Israel is the only way to secure Israel's future in the region. And if you think today has been a bitter pill for the Israelis to swallow, just think about that.
Yeah, very interesting and challenging times ahead, and we look forward to talking with you about them. Alistair Burt, former Middle East Minister, thanks very much for sharing us your expertise and insight into the latest from Israel and Gaza there. Let's go to Mike in Surrey, who wants to talk about this. Hello, Mike.
Hi there.
Welcome.
I don't know why people sort of getting all excited about this ceasefire, because it's a ceasefire. It's not the end of the war, is it? It's just another ceasefire.
No, it is a ceasefire with a theoretical roadmap that would allow them to have the peace deal. That's the theory. You're right, though. It's absolutely about a ceasefire.
Yeah, so 39 hostages are going to be released, and then 3 a week after that. No doubt something will go wrong, and then, like it always has in the past, and then it will all flare up again, as it always has in the past. I mean, it's never been successful in the past.
I don't know if you heard what Alistair Burt... Sorry. Well, you're right to point to history and say history could just repeat itself. I couldn't agree more. I thought it was interesting what Alistair Burt was saying there, who is certainly well-versed in this region. He was saying that actually every time the West has kind of intervened and tried to sort things out, going back to the sort of Carter, Camp David days, it's always failed. But this time there's a real appetite from the Arab nations and the Arab states to make peace work with a two-state solution. And he's basically saying that hasn't been tried. It's got to be worth a go, hasn't it?
I really don't think Hamas want a two-state solution. They never wanted. They just don't. They don't want a two-state solution. Yeah, they just don't. So it will.
You just think they want the annihilation of Israel?
It will work as long as it takes them to regroup, and then. But in all honesty, I don't know how it ever happened in the first place.
What happened? You mean the October the 7th?
I don't know how that ever happened in the first place. If they can target, what's it called? Mossad can target so well the paging incident where they can place the pages in all the...
yes, you're talking about when they literally took out the leadership through detonating, essentially, via pages, explosives.
Yeah, if they can target that so well, how they can let, like...
Well, there was clearly an intelligence breakdown, wasn't there, that led to the seizing of people and kidnapping and killing of people and frankly, just slaughter at the time. Listen, Mike, thanks very much for your contribution on that. That was before that we heard from Alistair Burt, former Middle East Minister. A two-state solution supported by, as he said, 57 Arab states will ultimately have more chance of success than anything else, but we're a long way from that. And however bitter a pill it is to release so many, to reach a ceasefire agreement that did not end with the annihilation of Hamas, however bitter pill that is for Israel, as he said, it may be an even more bitter pill to swallow that two-state solution. Time will tell. But for now, there is the prospect from 8:30 local time and 6:30 our time of actually a ceasefire in Gaza, which I think we all agree is much needed. 0344 499 1000. Coming up next, 5 years on from Brexit, has it been a success? Ben Habib, former Deputy Leader of Reform UK, will be joining me. And you can do the same with your calls on 0344 499 1000.
Under the deal, 33 Israeli hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza after 15 months of conflict will be exchanged for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails during the first phase that will last 6 weeks. Then Israeli forces will withdraw from densely populated areas of Gaza. Displaced Palestinians will be allowed back to their homes. Hundreds of aid lorries will then go in. There'll be more negotiations. The final stage then involves the reconstruction of Gaza. Well, I mean, that's going to take years, isn't it?
The Sun newspaper was better at monitoring an offender in the community than the probation service.
And better at detective work, seemingly.
Yes. How on earth can that be, that we have a national newspaper that supervises somebody in the community better than the probation?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Were you there 5 years ago, raising the Union flag, dropping the EU flag? The promise Brexit was delivered by Boris Johnson, or some would say it wasn't, or at least not completed. But at the time, as I said, lots of people were saying, well, it'll take time to judge the success of it or not. And then, of course, we had those torturous negotiations before 2019, which seemed to drag it on. In fact, if you go back to 2016, right up to 2019, took 3 years for us to actually leave. It was quite an achievement in its own right. But here we are, 5 years on. We don't talk about it that much. Ed Davey of the Liberal Democrats wants to rejoin, so I think we can safely say that's probably not going to happen in the foreseeable future. Keir Starmer, we know, wants to get us closer to the EU. One has a legitimate question there. Why particularly? What do you hope to gain? But here we are, 5 years. I'm not interested in their views. I'm interested in your views. 0344 499 1000. Joining me for about the next 20 minutes, I probably got that wrong, is the great Ben Habib, former Deputy Leader of Reform UK. And if you've got a question for Ben, pick up the phone, 0344 499 1000. He didn't know I was going to say that. He's probably going to go, you can't do that, Mr. de Bois. Hello, Ben.
Good morning, Nick. Good to see you. Good morning.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. The weird thing about this is I know it's January the 29th, but poor old Peter Cardwell, he's on his sickbed, so I'm standing in for him this weekend. He will be back next week, so I won't be here on the 29th. And I thought we should mark the occasion and get some views, not least yours. Let me ask you directly. Has Brexit been a mistake or a success?
Well, I think you know what my answer is going to be, and that is that we can't tell whether it would have been a success or a failure because we didn't actually leave the European Union. What we did was leave the institutions of the European Union. We left Parliament, the Commission, the European Court of Justice, the European Council, and so on. But what we didn't do was throw off the shackles of the regulations that hidebound the United Kingdom while we were a member. And indeed, we left Northern Ireland behind, subject to what's called dynamic alignment, adjusting to new EU laws as they're made, in 300 different areas of law, including human rights, state aid, VAT, excise duty, and so on. And we famously now, I think everyone listening will be aware, that we've got a border in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, something that is an anathema to anyone that believes in a sovereign, proud, independent United Kingdom. And so by any measure, any independent yardstick, we haven't actually left the European Union. We've left their institutions, but we haven't left their regulatory framework. And we can't chart a path for the United Kingdom with the United Kingdom's best interests at heart, with the interests of the British people at heart, if we're still dancing to the tune of Brussels regulations. Those regulations, just to remind listeners, I'm sure they're aware, are not made with our best interests in mind. They're made with Brussels' best interests in mind. I can't even say they're made with the citizens of EU member states' best interests in mind, because I think Brussels, it dances to its own tune. And so until we have recovered Northern Ireland into the United Kingdom, thrown that grappling hook out of our flesh, deviated on state aid, competition, employment, environmental laws, removed the ability, for example, of the EU to enforce its European arrest warrant on our territory without any real say from our own courts, withdrawn our money from funding their defence programmes, which we're still doing, Nick, as you may be aware. Until we've done all of that, we cannot judge whether Brexit's been a success.
Okay, so yes, I'm not entirely surprised by your answer there, but would you say that we've now got the worst of both worlds, having left and not, if you like, having a regulatory, or shall we say a frictionless trading arrangement with the single market, and equally bound by regulations that, for example, will make it difficult to have a trade deal with the US? Are we actually genuinely in the worst of both worlds? Or do you think actually, despite not having thrown off some of the shackles you've talked about, when you look at some of the stats on economic performance last year, we were doing okay compared to our neighbours?
Yeah, so just on trade, the UK has never done well with its relationship with the European Union. For decades, we've run a massive deficit, and we continue to run a massive deficit with the EU. And that has everything to do, effectively, with what the EU itself classes as the dumping of goods by foreign countries. I mean, effectively, you've got Germany, which is subsidized by the rest of the European Union in the sense that its currency is weaker than it should be, dumping goods on the United Kingdom. And we've run a trade deficit, as I'm sure you know better than I do, Nick, of around 100 billion a year, and we continue to run it, which is a massive drain on our finances and a massive pressure on sterling that we've had to, it's been an uphill struggle for us to cope with that trade deficit. Actually, I think the right approach would have been to cut trading ties completely with the European Union, deregulated our economy, cut taxes here, made our goods much more attractive to being bought by other countries, and rebalanced our trade with the EU, even if they imposed tariffs and so on. There would have been some short-term pain, but I think we need to rebalance that trade deficit.
This was the promise of Singapore on Thames, essentially, wasn't it, to liberate the economy and follow a much more liberal model. Do you think, though, that who was it who held us back? Was it a lack of political will and fear, or was it perhaps the way that we were so intricately woven into the EU? It was never a realistic proposition to go for such a liberalised economy that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not talking about a liberalised economy. I'm almost talking about slightly more protected economy, along not entirely dissimilar to what Trump is talking about, which is, you know, tariffs on goods being dumped on the US, but deregulating and cutting taxes so our own goods become very attractive to third countries.
But you would have brought corporation tax down and things like this and made it an attractive place to invest in, wouldn't you, and so forth?
Absolutely. That's what I think we should have done, what we should be doing. But I think you make a very powerful point. I think it's a combination of the two things you mentioned. A lack of political will, indeed a parliament that was, in most part, set against an independent United Kingdom, a parliament that really wanted to stay in the European Union. We've had 8 years, I think, of constitutional turmoil because parliament hasn't really been aligned with what the people want. And we saw that in the general election in 2024, where the turnout was very low, 59.5% turnout versus the 67.5% that Boris Johnson turned out in 2019. And I think that wasn't voter apathy, that was voter despondency, because they voted so many times for an independent United Kingdom, and they were just sick and tired of voting for something that they knew that they couldn't get. So I think voters stayed at home out of despondency.
It's very interesting. I'll come back to that point, but we've got Jerry on the line from Burton-on-Trent, and I know he wants to contribute to the conversation, so hopefully you can hear this. Hello, Jerry, go ahead.
Good morning, Nick, and what a treat to speak to Ben, the guy that we want as the proper leader of reform. That's what we all want. So power to your elbow. But honestly, Ben, it's fantastic. What I'd like to put to you, Ben, is that when we know that Theresa May's negotiated deal with the EU started on bended knee and she ended up on all fours. Could you clarify? This is a quote from Ian Duncan Smith, actually. Could you confirm that the outcome of these negotiations, which we're led to believe were always conditions imposed on us from the EU, such as restricted movement and having to get our passports properly checked when crossing the border, that was imposed by our civil service as a precondition. We insisted upon the EU and not the other way around. Very little publicity is given to this.
Okay, let's give Ben a chance. Just quickly though, are you planning to become leader of either Reform or another party, Ben? I'm jesting.
The answer is no, but I mean that's very kind of you to say. You say what was said, but as far as I'm aware, the well was poisoned in many respects in the negotiations that Theresa May did. I think she set up hurdles, or her team set up hurdles, which then made it very difficult for the United Kingdom to get what it wanted. The passport checks being perhaps one of them, but the most notable one, of course, was taking the bended knee to the notion that we couldn't have a customs border on the island of Ireland. It was that, conceding that point, that gave the EU the upper hand in negotiations over Northern Ireland, and therefore the entire United Kingdom. People seem to think that the Northern Ireland Protocol is just about Northern Ireland. It isn't. The Northern Ireland Protocol was a mechanism by which to keep the entire United Kingdom in check. And Theresa May knew it. I think she knew it. And she allowed that narrative to get absolutely established. Can't have a hard border on the island of Ireland. No one ever suggested a hard border, by the way. And indeed, without wishing to get drawn too much into this particular topic, there's an EU report, November 2017, which states that there's no need for a hard border, even if the customs border is put there. Everything could have been done through technology, or, APNR and so on. But impediments were put in the way of Brexit by an establishment that didn't want it. And we had Ed Davey. You mentioned Ed Davey earlier. We had Ed Davey, Sadiq Khan, others, the Speaker of the John Bercow, shuttling backwards and forwards to Brussels, basically briefing against the British people, briefing against the democratic will of the British people, trying to undermine Brexit. We've had one hell of an uphill struggle. And I just want to pick up on something you said, Nick, before, a little earlier, where you said, this is a process. It was not binary. And I completely agree with you. It's a process. We're still fighting for it. And the agenda we're all fighting for, and the agenda that President Trump is about to deliver for the US, is the same agenda that we're fighting for in Brexit. Put America first, put the United Kingdom first, strengthen our borders, enforce the UK's borders, deregulate the economy, ditch net zero. It's so damaging to our economy. You can't save the planet by emasculating our economy. Cut taxes, liberate the UK, do things for the British people. That's what we want.
Steady, Ben. I'm going to have all the phones ringing in a minute just to endorse your manifesto there. Listen, Jerry, thanks for taking that point to Ben. We're going to have a short break. Ben's going to stay with us at this point. You can join the conversation on 0344 499 1000.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. We clearly had a bit of a technical issue because I was wondering why no one was sending messages in. They have now all downloaded, so I've got quite a few to get through, and I'm going to do that as soon as I can. But since we're on topic, and I've got Ben Habib, former Deputy Leader of Reform, wanted by Jerry there, back as Leader of Reform. Ring in, ask him some questions if you wish. 0344 499 1000. He's with me for a few more minutes. Sue Van Sanden has said, Ben, Brexit has not been fully achieved thanks to the undemocratic Remainers. We should have left the ECHR immediately, says Sue. The ECHR, of course, often gets linked with the EU, which is not really the case, but it is a symptom of the frustration with institutions that many people feel are democratically unaccountable to us, including something like the ECHR. Ben, let me tell you this. The reason I got so passionately behind Brexit, funny enough, was I was sick to death of the lack of democratic accountability. You know, you've got 3 presidents in that EU. The Parliament was relatively powerless. That was the only way we had a say. And our governments, our own governments, would often hide behind the EU and blame them for things. So whilst I was, you know, not surprised but disappointed that the Conservatives got kicked out, we're kicking out the right people, the people who make decisions on our behalf. They are accountable to us. Now we have left those institutions. Not much is made of the improved democratic accountability. Shouldn't we be sort of singing more about that?
I think you're absolutely right. Being part of the EU was fundamentally against our democratic, imperative. But we're not free yet, Nick. You know, there's so many international institutions and international treaties which bind the United Kingdom that prevent us from being able to chart a genuinely democratic path. So the ECHR is a great example where we don't have control of our own human rights laws. But you take the Chagos Islands, you know, for example, the justification for handing the Chagos Islands back to, handing them over to Mauritius, the word back is completely wrong because it never belonged to Mauritius.
And paying them for the privilege.
And paying them for the privilege. That all was brought about by a UN ruling, a United Nations ruling, which frankly, we didn't have to take any notice of. But it's an international institution, and we take the knee to these internationals. So often we hear it being said that we can't do X, Y, and Z because of international law. There's no such thing as international law. We're bound by certain treaties, and we're part of certain organizations. And ultimately, we are accountable to the British people, and what we, the elected officials, are. At least I'm not elected at the moment. But you know what, as you rightly say, should happen is that when the elected officials don't represent the British people's best interests and they fail them, they should be removed from office, and there should be no hiding behind international law, international institutions, to the extent that there is an impediment to our own ability to do that which we need to do for our country through international commitments. Then we must ditch those international commitments.
Finally, we've got Keir Starmer, who's made no secret of his fondness for the EU. He clearly is not making it a policy overtly to rejoin. What is the future of Brexit under the current Labour government, do you think?
But the future of Brexit is inextricably linked to whether or not we continue to follow the liberal global socialist order, or we break, as I think the British people desperately want, for a democratic, sovereign, small c conservative order. And we've got to ditch that former thing, that sort of morass of international treaties, laws and institutions that I've been referring to. And I think we've got the best opportunity now with Trump as president, because he is ditching the liberal global order. He's turning his back on it and saying America has to come first. And unless we follow the United States of America by putting the United Kingdom first, we will find that our economy will do even worse. And the EU needs to wake up. Instead of Starmer rushing off to Paris and rushing off to Germany to try and find some kind of solace amongst a failing set of states against the new Trumpian vision of the US. Actually, what he ought to be doing is getting on board with Trump, turning his back on the liberal global order that is the European Union and all those in Europe that subscribe to that model, and doing what's right for the UK. He's got the cover for it. And if he doesn't do it, what we're going to find, Nick, is even more capital leaves the United Kingdom, even more bright, hardworking, committed British citizens leave this country, and they go to the US, where they can get a much brighter future. Money will go to the US, where it'll have less resistance in terms of, taxes and regulations, and more ability to make money. Capital flows across the globe in a very liquid way, and we've got to make the United Kingdom attractive for it. If the US gets more attractive, the money's going to go there.
Okay, Ben,
the writing is on the wall. We've got to get on with it.
You said I said final question last time. This is a very quick final question, though, to you. You said that's what Keir Starmer should be doing. In your heart, you don't think he's going to do it at all, do you?
No, he doesn't. He's completely a Europhile. He was caught when he thought he was off air in September 2023 in Montreal. He thought he wasn't on camera. And he said, if I were ever to become Prime Minister, I will align us so closely with the European Union that you won't even be able to tell that we're not a member. I think that's what he said just a year and a quarter ago. He's a Europhile through and through.
And time will probably see how that bears out. Ben, keep talking to us. Keep up the good work. Always, as ever, quite a refresher course when Ben comes on. I find myself going away all excited again. And at my age, 1 month from that state pension we've been talking about, that's no bad thing, I can tell you. Thanks to Ben Habib there. 0344 499 1000 coming up after the break. Your calls here with me, Nick de Bois, sitting in for Peter Cardwell this fine Saturday morning.
Under the deal, 33 Israeli hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza after 15 months of conflict will be exchanged for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails during the first phase. That will last 6 weeks. Then Israeli forces will withdraw from densely populated areas of Gaza. Displaced Palestinians will be allowed back to their homes. Hundreds of aid lorries will then go in. There'll be more negotiations. The final stage then involves the reconstruction of Gaza. Well, I mean, that's going to take years, isn't it?
The Sun newspaper was better at monitoring an offender in the community than the probation service.
And better at detective work, seemingly.
Yes, How on earth can that be, that we have a national newspaper that supervises somebody in the community better than the probation service? A convicted killer, no less. All praise to the Sun newspaper, all of shame to the probation service.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
And your chance to have your say, 0344 499 1000. Meanwhile, I've got to, many of you sent messages in. I'm now just going to rattle through some of them. Nick, good to see you back on Talk. Yes, I've been dragged out of retirement for the weekend. Regarding Brexit, we're still waiting for it to happen. We had the vote, but because we voted the wrong way, inverted commas, says Horatio, the politicians sat on their hands and didn't attempt to take any of the opportunities. As in Northern Ireland still in the EU, I think you'll find yourself in common agreement with Ben Habib there, and I do as well. Maddie, a strange one here, she sent this about 50 minutes ago. Nice balanced discussion on Brexit between three Remainers. Now, I assume you're talking to Matthew Hulbert, Liberal Democrat. Yes, very much a Remainer. Amy, a former Conservative comms director, who said she voted Remain. And I was the third person. Given I was in the negotiating room trying very hard to support Dominic Raab, out of choice, by the way, to negotiate our way out of Brexit, and voted to leave, I'm really curious as to why Maddie thinks I'm a Remainer. There you go, anything can happen. Honestly, Nick says, Mick, Brexit hasn't been a success, plainly because it hasn't been fully implemented. The exit was negotiated by Remainers pretending to be Leavers. That wasn't me. Brexit should have been negotiated by the man that gave it to Britain, Nigel Farage. When he's PM, it will. And on it goes. Quite a lot of those coming in. Just turning to WhatsApp. We've been talking about the state pension, which is kind of topical both for me and for the country. You've got some politicians, Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives. I'm not even sure the Labour denials, by the way, that they have any plans to change the state pension we can necessarily take at face value, since they seem to have it in for pensioners, given things like the winter fuel allowance, and then they're coming after their earnings when they're dead. Basically, through more inheritance tax. So I'm not quite sure what they're going to come up with on the pension. But we've been talking about the triple lock, which is this device that the Conservatives brought in 2010 that guarantees an uplift in your wages out of three indicators: the Consumer Price Index, average earnings, or a minimum of 2.5%. So at the very least, it's going to go up by 2.5%. Every year. And it's a huge chunk of money we spend on the state pension, about 11% of what we raise in taxes. But John Peters comes back and says to me, what's the point of the triple lock where they don't increase the tax threshold? When they don't increase the tax threshold, I think it should be written. It's just making some pensioners go into a tax return. If they can't fill out these forms themselves, they have to get an accountant, etc., etc. Raising the threshold will be better for low earners and pensioners. At the moment, that state pension is was pretty much in line with the tax threshold, and now it's going over. So yes, they'll start having the complications of tax. Just talking about my conversation when I was asking Matthew Hulbert, the Lib Dem activist, my guest in the first hour, if he had to choose between Donald Trump or President Z. Nick, such a difficult decision for your two political elite, Donald Trump or President Z. Hurty words against serious human rights violations. Yes, I too find it hard to make up my mind. Not, says John in Kent. Nick, it's obvious that this terrible government will look at the tax individual pensioners pay to determine if they need the state pension. That's means testing. What Don in Chelmsford is talking about is this other idea, which Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, in case you'd forgotten, she is arguing that, you know, we should look at means testing in this country. And what is means testing? It's basically saying you only qualify for certain benefits if you have less income than a certain figure. And that is basically a whole bureaucracy set up to test how much money you have before you are entitled to benefits. And yes, I'm using the word state pension and benefits together not because I think that's the right thing to do, but that is how the government view the state pension. In fact, when the state pension was introduced, it was defined in that legislation as a benefit. So don't get mad with me. I'm just explaining the terminology. And I think means testing is something that may happen. So look, if I'm brutally honest, I would be in the bracket that would probably get no state pension. But there's part of me that says, hang on, I've contributed to this national insurance scheme for my whole working life. And the promise to me was I would have a state pension at the end of it. And I expect them to deliver on that. Now, whether that needs reform for the future is, I think, a legitimate question. So maybe anyone under 50, for example, who's 15 years away from the state pension, maybe we start tapering it and reducing the amount of state pension if people think that we can't afford to keep paying it. Kemi Badenoch's Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, has basically said he doesn't think it's sustainable to keep increasing it by the triple lock. But I wonder what their thoughts are on means testing, and so it's called. If you do, says Mega Vegan, does that mean you're really mega vegan, or are you just taking the mickey there? If we means test the state pension, we should also means test the NHS. If you're a billionaire, you get to use it free. Is that fair? I mean, when you bring means testing in, you can means test pretty much whatever you like. But I'll tell you, there's a reason why that won't happen. And bear with me here, Mega Vegan. The idea that they means test people who use the NHS for two reasons. Because the more you earn, the more tax you pay. So there's an inherent justification there that you can still use it because you're paying more tax the more you earn. But the second thing is, when foreigners come over and use our NHS who want to pay for it, like American tourists, for example, I've met so many who said we tried to pay. The NHS says, oh no, we can't take your money. Let's go to Steve in Leeds. Hello, Steve.
Afternoon, Nick. How are you?
I'm very well. Yeah, you're 4 minutes. It's still good morning, Steve. Don't write your life off.
Just quickly on the state pension. Yes. I do agree we should change the triple lock, but what we should do is actually base your pension on the amount of years you work and pay tax.
Okay.
It seems to me that I've worked since I was 16. I'm 60 years old.
Yep.
Never been unemployed, paid all that tax, and my pension at the end of the day will be exactly the same as somebody who's never worked a day in their life. And now, I think that's unfair.
Now, now you're going to have to educate me here, because I thought it was based on the number of years you paid national insurance, depended on how much you got.
No, well, yeah, but the difference is minimal.
Okay.
If you don't work all your life, you don't get that much less as a state pension than somebody who's worked all their life. So to me, we've got a population now of people that aren't working that's growing. I think the government said last year 40% of the population are living on some kind of benefit.
Yeah.
So it's simple maths. All those 40% are going to want a pension in 20, 30 years' time, having paid not a jot into the system to
Exactly. So a contributory scheme. So if the government said to you, I don't care which government it is, tell you what, we're going to change it. And if you and from people who are now 30 or 40 years old, you've got to contribute X a month to get that state pension. Otherwise, you're going to get
unfair, Nick.
50
Nick,
quid.
I think that's unfair. If you base it on the number of years you work and pay tax, a cleaner on low income would get the same benefit as a millionaire banker, because it's based on the number of years you've worked and paid tax. It wouldn't penalise the low paid. If you make it a financial sum, you penalise those people who can't earn a lot of money.
Well, I think you've got a very good point. I like contributory schemes for benefits. I actually think if you fall into bad luck, you lose your job, or you qualify for the state pension later on, if you paid into the system, that system should be there to protect you. But with universal benefits, which is what we have now, I think we have to look at that, because otherwise we're just chucking the money out. Steve, great call. Thank you. Only saying goodbye because we're coming up to the top of the hour. Afterwards, I've got Charlie Rowley, former Tory special advisor. I want to talk about Kemi Badenoch, who's basically got on bended knee, not to take the knee, but to apologise for Tory mistakes, and thinks this is the way for the next year or so, because that way she will earn trust. Will the Conservatives earn your trust? 0344 499 1000. Keep your calls coming here to join the conversation with me, Nick, on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. The last half hour with me, Nick de Bois, sitting in for Peter Cardwell, who I'm sure is getting better as we speak. We're having a very good conversation about the state pension. A little bit of self-interest here. It's on February 23rd, coming up, not far away. I shall be drawing mine. But we've been talking about the affordability of it, and can actually we continue to maintain it with both the triple lock that guarantees a minimum of a 2.5% increase every year, or should it even be means tested? And lots of ideas coming in. And Nick from DJB says, Nick, a relatively simple answer to the state pension is to remove it from those paying higher income tax rates. And whilst that's a very simple way of doing it, I actually think you start paying higher rate taxes at a relatively, I know I'm going to get shot down for this, a relatively low income. And I think it's 40,000 after allowances. And actually, I don't think that's fair. If you've been working hard all your life and you get up to the higher rate tax pay, which is easily enough done in this country for many people, it starts to become quite a penalty on you. But the idea that Steve was talking about of a contributory system, whereby actually if you pay your national insurance or you're paying into the system, whether it's that device or another one, then you qualify for it. The more years you have it should perhaps determine the qualification to get the state benefit, not necessarily a different amount, but the state benefit. And there's not a lot that it's true at the moment. You qualify for it with national insurance years, but at the moment, if you don't work, that national insurance is paid for by the state, so you still get it. We're talking about getting people back to work. Maybe that's one of the devices we should use. Meanwhile, who prompted all of this? Well, it was Kemi Badenoch. Now, just in case you've forgotten, Kemi Badenoch is leader of the Conservative, the official opposition to the government. After getting a slaughtering at the last election, the Conservatives returned something like 130 MPs or thereabouts. She has been making probably a first major speech, to be fair, since winning her leadership, where she's talking about some themes. She's developing some themes, of which the key is to earn your trust. Now, you may think an election's a long way away and maybe it's not of interest, but she's essentially wants to go on bended knee and do a mea culpa and say, we have to learn from our mistakes. Well, I'm certainly not going to apologise for all 14 years of the Conservative government, and I don't think she's suggesting that. But I do think that we may end up with too long doing this mea culpa, going on bended knee and begging the electorate to trust us because we're prepared to say after getting a good thumping at the election how bad we were on certain things. Is this a good strategy? Is this actually going to capture your attention? Do you even care if the Tories acknowledge what they got wrong? Or is it a vital part of rebuilding trust so that they may earn your vote in the future? Charlie Rowley, former Tory special advisor during those 14 years, or some of them, he joins me to discuss this and some other aspects which we'll delve into. Charlie, welcome.
Good afternoon, Nick. Thanks for having me.
How is life as a former Conservative advisor in a Labour government? Are you in more demand or less demand these days?
Well, it's certainly less stressful.
Is that because you're not defending decisions?
I think that's partly true, and I think you can absolutely have more ability to form your own opinion, speak your own mind, and actually still be part of the conversation, where I think actually some political parties still have this inertia about sort of speaking out too much or too often not answering a question. So yeah. I think it's much more stress-free on this side.
Okay, let's see if I can up your stress levels then. Kemi Badenoch, we're going to be honest about mistakes we made. I'm tempted to say, so what? But actually, is this a good idea, just to do the mea culpa thing and say we were awful, please give us another chance, which is where it's going to lead to?
Well, I think it's necessary, and I think it is the right thing to do, but I think you're also right that I think you've got to acknowledge the mistakes, but over that 14-year period, I think clearly there were some achievements.
Education standards, which Labour is setting about ruining. We did really, you know that, you were in that department, weren't you?
Exactly. Well, I certainly worked for
Michael Gove,
Michael Gove, the Secretary of State, when he was for Education. I wasn't with him when he was at the Department for Education. That was just slightly before my time. I was still working for an MP in Hertfordshire in 11-14. So I know that part of the world quite well.
Okay,
But I think what the Conservative Party has never been able to really do, or has always been shy about, is talking up its achievements. It's a kind of party that gets on, just works hard, does the job, or that's how it portrays itself as, delivering on things and then moving on to the next thing. And I was having this conversation, funny enough, not so long ago with somebody else, where I think I couldn't remember whether it was Tony Blair's last conference speech, or I think it was Gordon Brown's in the Labour Party conference in 2009, I think, before the election, where despite all of the problems that the Labour Party had got itself into, whether it was Iraq, whether it was crashing the economy in 2008, the financial crash, he still went out there and talked about things like Sure Start children's centres, about pensioner credit. So they still had a mantra that excited an electorate, that still made you think, even if you were totally fed up after the 13 years of Labour and the infighting between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, there was still something there in the back of the public's mind that, we might not like Gordon so much, he's a bit grumpy, but actually, Labour, they have got something to shout about. So there is the risk that Kemi does talk about the negatives and none of the positives, because let's not forget, there have been 3 general elections where the public were able to vote out the Conservatives, and they voted for them right up until 2019. So it couldn't have been bad for all of those 14 years.
No, look, that's a fair point. But if I think what's grating with me a little bit, and she uses this analogy because she talks about, look, we've had our worst ever defeat. This is Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservatives. In order to be listened to again, it's important that we rebuild trust with the public. Well, and this is the analogy she uses. When you've had a breakup, I'm assuming this is like a personal relationship thing we're meant to identify with. You don't just carry on as if nothing's happened. You've got to show contrition, show you've learnt from your mistakes. And it's really important that the public know that the Conservative Party is under new leadership. It's not the same thing they kicked out in July. And I mean, is it that important? Because if ever I talk Conservative policies or politics to anyone, they're not interested, basically, because we're not going to be around for about 4 years. Is it better that she just quietly gets on rejigging the party rather than telling us all to trust her because she's not the same as the lot that came before?
Well, I think there are two things there. I mean, yes, of course, if you have a breakup, you've got to show a bit of contrition, but you've also got to show a new lease of life, and that includes a bit of hope, a bit of optimism about obviously doing things a bit differently if you've changed and you want to demonstrate that you've changed. So that's what she's got to do. So you've got to announce some policies. I know there might be a bit of a hiatus over a couple of years, which was reported last week, I think, where she says she doesn't want to announce things too soon, but I think the problem that Kemi, I think, might have is that you can demonstrate you want to do politics differently by thinking things through and then being absolutely honest and straight with the public about how you're going to do those things differently. So whether that's going for growth. So in her speech yesterday, she talked about Brexit was something that the Conservative Party talked up before having a plan for growth. That we didn't have a plan, we legislated for net zero in 2050 without working out how to do it. So having a change of thinking and approach to things as to how we're going to fix something before announcing it is probably not a bad idea.
Yes, but isn't she also letting a quality that's often been attributed to her, which is kind of a bit of a loose cannon, shooting from the hip? She kind of, in interviews, it's almost like she's thinking aloud, which is why she got into trouble when she started talking about maternity leave and reforming maternity pay, because it's like she's thinking aloud. It's not thought out. The triple lock pensions row, she kind of talks and suggests means testing and perhaps removing the triple lock are things that we should be prepared to have conversations about with. All that does is leave a great big open goal for the government and other opponents just to attack her and say they're going to get rid of the state pension. Crazy, surely.
Yes, I think there is clearly a case to look at pensions and pension reform. So, it is obviously a case that if you are maybe a very, very wealthy pensioner, both in terms of cash terms as well as assets or any other marker, that maybe that particular type of pensioner might not have needed.
But why float the idea without, tabling it as a consultation at the very least, or something?
Well, I think you're right. I think that's, it's all very well being part of the conversation or to try and generate news by throwing ideas out there, but you've got to be able to back them up. But the one thing that I would worry about is that even if you have the best policy in the world that fixes it all, that is straight talking, that is well thought through, that isn't promising anything that can't be delivered, there still has to be, despite the total rejection that the Tories got last summer, there has to be an element of hope, optimism and politics, because otherwise you end up doing what Theresa May ended up doing in 2017, which might have been the best plan for social care that's been come up with. It wasn't particularly popular, but it might have been the plan to actually fix what is currently still a crisis in this country. But obviously that was rejected and people were put off by that because they thought, well, that's a bit tough, or that sounds a bit hard. And so voters still, despite calling for hope and trust in politics, and they want to see politicians deliver on what they say they're going to do, you've still got to present a package that is appetising.
The truth is, though, the public don't trust politicians. I don't think, even if I probably had the most ardent reform supporter here in front of me, if I grilled them, they'd probably say, I love what they're saying. I really want to believe they're going to do it, but deep down they probably think, oh, maybe they're just like the rest of the politicians and won't deliver. I don't know. What's the point of trying to earn the trust when no one really trusts politicians?
Well, it's a question of the trust in politics. More broadly, I think, and trust in the state. So you might not trust or believe Nigel Farage or Richard Tice or anyone that's in reform, but I think the reason why there's so much momentum at the minute behind them is because they're saying, it's a Westminster problem, or it's a civil service problem, or there's too much bureaucracy.
And do you agree with that? Because I think there's a lot of truth in that.
I do, and I think, look, I was very worried when I saw Yvette Cooper, I think, in the House of Commons the other day, deliver her statement on the grooming gangs scandal, for example, the rape gangs inquiries. This is a woman who has been in government before, in a Labour government. She's been Shadow Home Secretary. She's been chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee whilst she was in opposition. She should be perfectly placed to say to a government department, a department that was by one of the former Labour Home Secretaries, to say that it wasn't fit for purpose. It still clearly isn't. To not be able to capture the mood of the nation and say, look, there's clearly an issue in various different parts of the country, up to 50 towns and cities we're told about there might be these grooming gangs, and how there's been a failure of the social services, of local authorities, of the police not investigating them properly. This calls for a real inquiry, and I'm taking the lead to do it. She seems to have been captured by the Home Office.
Do you subscribe to the theory, though, that actually it's not Labour are worried about such an inquiry because it would expose some of their own party members in councils up and down the country?
Well, inevitably it would. But I think that shouldn't be news to people, because there are the councils that were already investigated, whether that was Andy Burnham trying to have one in, or did have one in Greater Manchester, but he was calling for a national one because he couldn't compel the police by law to come and give evidence. And Greater Manchester, the authority, certainly Rochdale way, I think he was looking at it, I think is obviously a Labour council. Oldham, Telford, these places we know have got local authorities that are led by Labour councillors, and that's where a lot of the problems lies. Now, a national inquiry could expose that there are councils up and down the country of whatever political colour where there are problems here, but we'll never know until you have such an inquiry.
OK, listen, last question for you. Kemi Badenoch's probably not had the best December a leader of the opposition would have liked. There's some suggestion, she might be getting her mojo a little bit now. I personally am not convinced by her at all. I wasn't convinced when she stood as the front runner. Do you think that by the end of this year, after what even she agrees are going to be very hard May local elections, she'll still be in place? Can she cut it as a leader of an opposition party seriously aspiring to government?
I think she will, because I think the one thing that the Tory party has to do is give Kemi time. Yes, of course, you can't just go out there and make speeches and and not be part of the national conversation. But the one thing that Kemi has got to do is stay true to herself as well. And it comes to the point that you were touching on about Kemi. She does shoot from the hip. Now that can be a negative, but Nigel shoots from the hip, and it can be a positive. So she's got to be herself. She's also got to attract a younger generation of people coming back to the Conservatives. If it's the case that after a year and a half that there's still no movement in the dial, then I think that's when people might start to get a bit jittery.
I think the few remaining Conservative MPs will always be looking over their shoulder at their seats, Charlie. You know that. I am certain of that. Thanks very much for joining us. Former Tory Special Advisor Charlie Rowley there on the, shall we say, the first big speech that Kemi Badenoch has made. Is apologising enough? Do you think it's an important start? Can it rebuild trust in the Conservatives? The only message I've got on this one, which kind of goes to my point, I don't think anyone's listening to the Conservatives, is basically the only way the Tories will ever gain my trust would be if they stand down in all seats at the next general election where Reform came second in 2024. Michelle says in Worcestershire, this country needs Farage for PM. 0344 499 1000. And you can join the conversation with me, Nick de Bois, here on Talk.
Under the deal, 33 Israeli hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza after 15 months of conflict will be exchanged for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails during the first phase that will last 6 weeks. Then Israeli forces will withdraw from densely populated areas of Gaza. Displaced Palestinians will be allowed back to their homes. Hundreds of aid lorries will then go in. There'll be more negotiations. The final stage then involves the reconstruction of Gaza. Well, I mean, that's going to take years, isn't it?
The Sun newspaper was better at monitoring an offender in the community than the probation service.
And better at detective work, seemingly.
Yes. How on earth can that be, that we have a national newspaper that supervises somebody in the community better than the probation service? A convicted killer, no less. All praise to the Sun newspaper, all shame to the probation service.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Alan in Nottinghamshire says, Nick, great to see you again and good show. Could you please ask Ben if he would consider, Ben Habib would consider returning to reform, or has he burnt all his bridges? I did ask him if he wanted to be leader, I think. Nick, what I find bemusing about Ben Habib is that everything he says about leaving the EU is absolutely correct and the most important aspect of our leaving the EU. But he has abandoned the most effective tool in righting these faults by leaving reform over an internal technicality, says Chris in Ottershaw. Thank you for your views. Keep them coming. 0344 499 1000. Charlie in Derbyshire. Hello, Charlie.
Good afternoon, Nick. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. Couple of minutes for you, Charlie, before we hand over to Talk Sport. The airways are yours.
Right. When they mention pensions,
yeah,
I wish at the same time they cost 38 billion. Now, what we get, I mean, I used to pay £175 a week national insurance stamp.
Yeah.
So why should I be means tested?
Yeah.
When I paid that much?
No, it's a perfectly legitimate point. I think if people, I don't know how old you are, I won't inquire, but I think the deal was, and the same deal for me, you'll get a pension if you pay your national insurance. Simple as that. So you've got to honour it.
Now, there's a mate of mine, he worked for council. He took early retirement at 60. He got a 250,000 lump sum and a pension of 24,000 a year.
Public sector pensions.
Now, when he's 67, he'll get the pension as well. What we get.
Yeah.
I mean, my council tax is 2,600, and 30 goes to their pensions. It's ridiculous. I mean, so if you're going to cut pensions, don't cut ours, cut theirs.
The public sector pensions are very, very generous. There's no question about that. And do you know what? The government don't even include their liability when they talk about all the debt we have. It's quite staggering. Hey, Charlie, I think we lost you there, but perfect timing, of course. Thanks very much for joining us here today. It's been a fantastic show. We're switching over to Talk Sport, where Sam Matterface and Stuart Pearce will be at today's live game, Newcastle versus Bournemouth. Now, I've had a great time. I'll be seeing you here again tomorrow, so do join me from 10 o'clock, sitting in, of course, for Peter Cardwell, when we'll do this all over again. But in the meantime, over to Talk Sport, joining Sam Matterface, Stuart Pearce for today's live game, Newcastle versus Bournemouth.